we're incredibly fortunate tonight to have two phenomenal sportsmen to assist us in the presentations of this evening's subjects, and they will both be talking about separate issues. But yeah, it's going to be a real treat this evening. And the first of our special guests and guest speakers tonight is a Paralympian called James Roberts. And just a bit of history in James. So James is he's a wheelchair basketball player and a Paralympian based down in Wales. James was sadly born with a disability. However, not deterred, he then took up sport, started off life as a swimmer and progressed through a variety of other sports, rowing, sitting volleyball. He's competed in Beijing in the Olympics and also in the London Olympics, representing Great Britain in many sports. A real pleasure to have you here, James. Welcome.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the introduction, Ian.
A truly fantastic bit of footage there about some of your achievements. Clearly, we haven't got long enough to capture them all, but absolutely fantastic. James, please tell us how you got involved in sport in the first place.
Oh, that's a good question, Ian. I got involved in able-bodied sport before I ever got into Paralympic sport. So I started relatively late, at the tender age of, if I remember rightly, about 11. And obviously it was trying to find a sport in which my disability wouldn't be used against me. So my family thought, well, why not put you into swimming? And obviously with discussions with coaches and my mom, they kind of said, well, what discipline could he use within swimming that isn't actually an asset? So I swam a butterfly, which probably most technically stroke going out there at, I think I was about 12 or 13. So I started relatively young, and then you see people copy me. And a lot of people, they were probably too young to do it. And then it wasn't until I was 15 when one of the coaches, with me living out overseas because my parents been in the forces, said, well, why don't you try your hand at disability sport? I didn't know what to say, because I'd been up until that point, mainstream sport, Paralympic sport was not in the media front and center as it is now. And it's still, I think, got some ways to go. But even I looked down on it as it wasn't an equal to the Olympics. And so I kind of said, well, I'll take on board what you say. I didn't know what to say. So I kind of was in that rebellious state of, well, I can compete within reason amongst my peers, but I also look negative towards disability. But I eventually was a bit open-minded and think, well, what's the worst that can happen? And pretty much what we now, nearly 20 years on, I've had a sporting career as a result of that.
Okay, that's fantastic. And I think, as you say, you started off swimming, and you've gone across so many different sports. Was there any particular reason why? It was just the opportunity was there and you just grabbed it and went for it?
Not particularly. I think with disability sport, I think there is that stage of transition is more. It will happen more so than maybe in able-bodied sport. I made the transition from swimming to rowing because of being dropped by British Swimming. That wasn't my choice. It happened probably at the most inconvenient time in my life, as I'd just gone to university. So it was All the decisions up to that point would be very, very much around sport. Where I went to study for my undergraduate was Swansea University. I chose to go there because the program was based there, and it was kind of my dreams or aspirations were kind of turned on their head. And luckily, I was still in Wales, and Disability Sport Wales kind of said, "Well, we don't want you to lose you from sport entirely. What's your thoughts on doing rowing?" I was very skeptical at first as well. I've only known swimming. I don't know if I'll be any good at this sport, but it was a chance conversation that I then turned into a TEDx talk at the beginning of this year, of the conversation of my mum said to me, "Well, you could be very, very good at it, absolutely useless." And ultimately, people outside of sport will view the second one as a negative, as, well, why would your family tell you that you're going to be useless at something? But I saw that as a double positive. I could be good at it, which I turned out to be, or I could be not so good at it and I do something else, but I don't quit. And I think that's probably the difference between obviously sportsmen and women and people that maybe don't necessarily gravitate towards exercise for whatever reason that is. And then obviously the transition from rowing to volleyball was I'd been reclassified, but I knew the year leading after Beijing that it was going to come in. So I had a plan in place, as I'd have sat down at a meeting with GB rowing, Welsh rowing, you name it, everybody was in that meeting, and they kind of said, "Well, we'd like you to come back and you finish your career within the sport riding out on the white horse." Because that ultimately didn't happen, but I was willing to come back with some assurances of, if I beat everybody that's put in front of me, that's the end of the story, which wasn't the case previously, because everybody got second chance, but I didn't. And then obviously when volleyball came in to the picture, I was in my final year of university, so I did a little bit, probably for the first time in my life, put my education first as well. I wanted to come out with a decent degree, and then obviously my time in the institution has been worthwhile for me, more specifically. So I did that for probably, I think top of my head, about 3 months, and I got a little bit bored. I was like, well, I can't just do sleep, study, and repeat. This is dull. I needed something else to whet my appetite. So I did go back. I didn't make the team straight away. I think by the summer of 2010, I'd broken into the GB program, and I got a phone call in the summer of, "Do you want to go to the World Championships?" I don't think anybody would turn that down an opportunity. You're giving me something on a plate. I don't know what they were expecting for me to say over the phone. Mine was, "Okay, I'll bite your hand off it." And then pretty much that was the starting point for my volleyball career. I think I went on to ascertain, I think it was 55 caps in the end.
Oh, that's incredible. You've spoken throughout that about mental approach, positive approach, all that sort of thing, which would you say that's equally as important as has been in peak physical condition or training the best you can for that? How much of what percentage
would you
put on it?
I think sport talks about the 1% when it comes to mindset, but I would probably, now I've come out of sport and involved in the coaching side, I would say it's even bigger. And I think as sport has evolved, it's become more and more paramount within the sport, as pretty much these are marginal things that we're talking about, but in the grasp of any sport, they have a massive impact. So if you can prepare an athlete, a coach, a referee to be able to deal with some of these pressures they're going to come under, they're better suited. So the earlier you can expose an individual to that, the better.
Okay, that's great. I'm just going to pause for a second. I think we've got a question already. Chris, do you want to jump in with that question?
Yeah, it's one mainly directed from some of our YMOs, so some of our young match officials. So obviously we've got a number of them going through uni and balancing education and refereeing ambitions. What advice would you give to those young athletes having to navigate these decisions at such a critical time?
I think this is where communication is paramount. And I think with the evolution of technology, this is becoming a lost art. This is where you need to talk with your institution to be able to make them aware of your ambitions. And I was lucky to probably be maybe ahead of my time in terms of any deadlines that I had the sporting calendar alongside it. So if there was any clashes, I could probably bring that to the table. They never occurred, but if the chance occasion that it did, I was prepared, and I could kind of go to my department and say, well, we've got this on this particular day. I might be somewhere else in the world. Can we make allowances for I either submit a piece of coursework early? Can I have an extension? And I've since spoken to my undergraduate university recently. They've come on leaps and bounds from me being an undergraduate 10 years ago. So they pretty much, the lectures will be recorded. You have access to the Zoom. So it's kind of gone leaps and bounds in terms of supporting people's ambitions, because ultimately they want you to have the best experience possible of your, however long you're there, 3 years, maybe a little bit longer. So ultimately they want the best for you, because they're running a business at the end of the day. So they want you to have a good experience. So then you will refer people on to, well, I had a good experience of this institution. I would highly recommend you to go to that. I obviously won't name ones, but in terms of going to that particular institution, because they've been as supportive and have probably gone above and beyond. I didn't mention that in the introduction. My university allowed me to up sticks from South Wales to obviously Reading to be able to accomplish my I'll call it it's not really an objective, my ambition of representing my country at the highest level.
Some of the things you said, clearly you've had preparing for tournaments, competitions, all that sort of thing. You've had incredible coaches. You've given so much sacrifice to get yourself ready with the skill set and everything else. How mentally do you prepare, or did you prepare for these tournaments?
Ooh, if I'm honest, probably not as well as I probably could have done, but that's probably useful exuberance of you think you know best. And you talk to probably any athletes throughout their career, most have probably done things that they maybe in the later years of their career kind of say, well, I wish I'd have done it this way. Obviously, sports psychology has come on a lot in 10, 15, 20 years of, I would maybe look at it in the height of my career as you would only see the sports psychologist if there's something wrong. And themselves, I think sports psychologists are kind of coming out into YouTube, things on television to do with sport, and kind of saying, well, that's maybe when you need to catch the athletes when they're at their height, because ultimately it could be gone in a blink of an eye and they're unprepared. So that's probably something that I've explored more with my degree. And then obviously I've looked to learn more after sport to kind of get, well, ultimately people are all the same. It comes down to what's in between the ears. And I've probably looked to listen more when people were giving me information, because of the more that I can learn, and I'm able to kind of have a domino effect and be able to spread that wisdom. I don't mind being that facilitator, because ultimately I'm having that first-hand experience of learning something new and a different perspective on looking at mindset of how people have adapted to their sporting environment, their impact of where they come from a socioeconomic factor, and all things like that. Because ultimately the trajectory of sportsmen and women is ultimately to get to the highest level that they can, but they all come from different avenues.
Yeah, okay. Was there any, as well as a sports psychologist, was there any sort of particular techniques that you used that got you in the zone, if you like, that got you prepared in the build up to and obviously during these competitions and tournaments?
It was heavily around music as a motivator and using cues of visualization to enact. I don't know, but I think the best one I can think to memory was my coach would have me visualize one of my competitors next to me, and be it if it was testing, to be able to get a little bit more out of me, to be able to find that little bit extra within myself. That obviously is mental. It's not physical that's going to stop you. It's whether or not you deem that you can push past the pain, the red wall, so to speak. But I think from like techniques that I've probably learned after sport, probably be more beneficial of it's a Tony Robbins technique of it. I'll show people because then they can visualize it. It's kind of you would shut your eyes and you're kind of thrusting the power down to you towards you, and that's something that I've learned more in business from my coach, of to refocus your energy. So it's very much looking at every technique possible and looking to what is going to get you into your optimal state. There is another technique of screaming. I mentioned to that Mike the other day of, as a referee, you probably could intimidate both set of teams if you went into your changing room and started shouting at the top of your voice.
You're obviously part of a team sport for some of those things, and as referees, when we make decisions, they can often be game changing. And if you ask most players, most of those have been a wrong decision or a mistake as well. If you were if you were in a game and you made a mistake that was affecting for your team, how did you deal with that, either immediately afterwards or in the aftermath to the game?
I think that's an interesting question from two perspectives, Ian. I think the first one, obviously, as a player, really forget about that decision. That's just happened. I think it's easier for the athlete because you've got to be able to let it go, because you dwell on you're going to make more and more mistakes, and ultimately, from the other perspective of analyzing after the fact of any team sport, you make a mistake, it's going to be showcased by a coach of, you made this mistake, this cost us, but it's ultimately to right the wrongs and to put you in a positive, to learn from. And everybody's heard the saying, you learn more from losing than you do winning, because ultimately if you're winning, you can paint over the cracks. And for me specifically, I think when I've moved into wheelchair basketball, people are still kind of, well, why do you be so hypocritical of your performance? Because I want to get better. I'm nitpicky of, yes, I played particularly well in your eyes. I think I could have played better. So it's being, I would say, optimistic from one perspective, because it's looking at all outcomes. As if you look at it from a perspective of, I'll use the saying of, you look at it from 10,000 feet, you look at it from a bigger picture, you don't get engrossed into the trenches of, the small marginal gains, because by looking at a bigger picture, you can analyze it a little bit better, as to, you can pick up certain trends that you might have towards a specific area that you keep making possibly the same mistake over again, and you can kind of say, well, okay, why am I making this decision? And then vice versa, if it's a positive decision, why do I keep doing this reward? And look at it more from a bigger perspective, and it gives you more data points, if I was used in an analytical sense, to kind of say, well, I'm making these things. I think with not having crowds, you're not going to be swayed from that perspective as well, because you're not going to be having the home advantage, kind of saying, well, we want this person carded because we don't agree with the foul play. But if you put it on the other perspective, if they were on the receiving end, they wouldn't want you to red card. They wouldn't want you to yellow card, or at worst red card one of their players. So sport's very, very tribal in that sense. But I think from an athlete and both an officiating standpoint, it's being able to take that step back. But obviously you can't have that luxury of kind of being the spectator, because then you'd be scrutinized for, well, you're not really officiating here. Whereas the athlete can kind of hide at times, or I've made a mistake. So if I remove myself out of the field of play for a little bit, I can forget about the mistake and then get on the ascendancy again. So I think it's easier from the athlete perspective to be able to, I would say, kind of being a mistake, because it's like, well, it's happened. I can't do anything about it, but if I dwell on it, they're just going to manifest and ultimately become more and more of a problem. And ultimately, if I make too many mistakes, I'll be sitting on the substitutes bench.
Yeah, got it. Okay, that's great. I think at this point we've got a couple more questions, so I'll just bring Chris back in.
Yeah, so the first one comes from Harry Wilkinson Roberts, sort of regarding what we've just been talking about. He's asking, sort of during the big moments in an event, so say you've made that mistake, do you try and remain calm and be clear, or do you allow yourself to be connected to the moment emotionally? So I guess what he's sort of trying to ask is, how do you reset when something's gone wrong, or when something's not gone as it's planned?
Well, it's difficult, that's because obviously it's an emotional charge event. It's trying to stay in the logical sense of, I've made a mistake, and I think the Six Nations this year showcases that, as referees have made mistakes, and obviously that you're still the boss. That's probably the difference between rugby and football. You're still in control. And I did have an official in basketball say to me, and he was like the head official for GB basketball. He just said to me in the changing room, as a player, have you ever made a mistake? And as a player, you can't say anything to that, because like you will make probably tens of mistakes in a game, but they're not actually showcased unless you're at the top of the game and it's on television. But because the official is deemed to be, one in charge, I can't make mistakes. But this is what I said to Mike on his podcast. You're a human being at the end of the day. And I think the athlete is starting to be showcased as, they're not robots. Yes, they're there for entertainment, but they are human beings under whatever jersey they're wearing. And obviously the referee will get the ref under the green no matter what. It's a thankful task. But if it wasn't for a referee, you can't officiate the match. The standard of play would be a lot lower, and people would be moaning about that as well. So I think, how do you take yourself away from the event that's happened? It's trying to stay logical. It's like, so I think it's trying to stay as far away from the emotion or the attachment. I'm trying not to get too sciencey here. Trying to not get into a state of feeling towards what you've done. So you've made a wrong decision, you feel guilty. It's trying to stay away from that. It's like, I've made a mistake, but it's not going the other way, and I'm gonna obviously make up for my mistake. You've made it. It's up for the team more so than you to change, because ultimately you're the boss. If you've chosen to referee like this today, obviously the team that wins has been able to play to your rules. So it's I think, so if I wrap it up and kind of make my point, it's trying to stay as logical as you can, and that's obviously difficult because you're going to get into the emotion of what's going on.
That's brilliant. And then we got one more at the minute, just from Simon Starr, saying there's a perception in individual sports, men and women, respond more effectively than teams to the input from sports psychology. So as an athlete who's performed as a team player and as an individual athlete, do you have any experiences that can confirm or dismiss that perception?
I'm an outlier for that. This is where I'm going to disagree. I didn't use it, sports psychology, that much, bar probably my sports degree, as I would use my lectures in sports psychology to be able to deal with certain adverse moments in my individual sporting career. But where we actually had a team psychologist was in a team sport, and she would make it I'd say objective to get to know the individual, as what buttons that you need to push to be able to get the best out of them. So then it was very much, assistant coach, head coach, sports psychologist, and they'd work as a triumvirate to be able to get to know that individual and ultimately feedback to the coach. Well, you need to push this button for this individual. So it's man management at the end of the day, and that's what coaching has become. It's not a case of one size fits all now. You can't do that. And I think me now going into the coaching role myself, I think people assume that's how I would coach, as how I've been coached. But no, I can't treat you as the same individual because of, life experiences. What you've been actually exposed to is going to be completely different from one to the next. So for me, I probably learned more from my time in team sport, but that's probably the evolution of sport itself. It's been more embracing of it. Whereas when I started my career as a 15, 16-year-old, it was in its infancy. Well, why would I see a sports psychologist when everything is going well? You normally would go, that was my perception. Some people might disagree, but I was more open at the latter end of my career to kind of say, well, things are going well. How do we replicate it? If it's not going so well, why? And then obviously the middle of the ground, why we particularly there. And I think because I was open to it, and I think I'd been exposed to it probably more than most of the team anyway through my degree, I was willing to probably be more open than most people. You can't decide if I'm selected or not, but you can give me the tools to be able to deal with failure, to deal with not being selected, to deal with, I don't know, for argument's sake, being away from home, and all these things that could unravel an athlete.
As referees, when whether we've had a bad day or otherwise, we tend to come in for quite a lot of criticism, whether that's an excuse for the losing side, whether people think we've affected a game in a certain way that didn't help that sport, whether indeed we've had it from an observer that's come down to check on our progress, to check on our performance. So from a number of angles, and I'm sure in team sports it's very much the same, whether it's coaches, whether it's media, whether it's somewhere else. How did you deal with that criticism? How did you get yourself up, ready, and motivated to go back and do it all again?
Oh, I still don't do very well with criticism nowadays, Ian. But I think it's human nature to not like be criticized, because I think from the basis of being scrutinized, you can get defensive, because you'll kind of say, well, if you were in this position, what would you have done differently? I think for me specifically, I think because Paralympic sport's not in the media spotlight as much, I didn't get as much media scrutiny. I think the only time we did was with the volleyball team after London, and we were fuming because we did better than the women's team, and they kind of portrayed it in the same light. I'd have loved to have seen if they'd have done it early in the tournament, and it actually would have been a bonus, because any negative publicity within sport, we'll cut that out, smack it on the wall, and ultimately I'm going to show you. Whereas it comes to the referee, obviously you can't do that. It's difficult because you're going to be kind of outcast for a number of, obviously the national teams did it in Six Nations. It's like, well, instead of blaming the referee, in camp they probably wouldn't have done that, but in the media, I don't know why they do it, because I know you're looking for a scapegoat, but some of these teams didn't look at themselves in there. They've lost the fixture, not the referee. If your indiscipline is going to cost you a game, that is a problem. So coming back to the original question of how do you deal with criticism, is looking at it from both perspectives. Looking at, is it positive criticism or is it negative criticism? And ultimately, negative criticism is everywhere because of social media. So everybody's got an opinion. And I've been brought up probably from an older generation of, if you haven't got anything good to say, don't say it at all. So I would probably stop at in the middle as well. Is my opinion going to make you better as an individual? If the answer is no, I won't say it. But obviously other people don't agree with that. Whereas if it's positive criticism, you need to swallow it. You need to swallow the ego and kind of say, well, I need to take on board this feedback. It's easy when you ask for it because it's like, well, I want to make myself better. I've got to take this criticism because ultimately it's going to make me a better individual. So looking at it from both perspectives. So if it's positive, it's embracing it and looking at it's going to make me a better referee, it's going to make me a better player. Whereas if it's negative criticism, obviously it's a lot more difficult than it once was because you can't hide away from Instagram, Twitter, Facebook because you're tagged in it. But if you're able to remove, coming back to my point about the emotion and feeling towards that comment, it makes it easier. I know it's going to become more and more problematic because that's not going to go away, but it's trying to look at it from a simplistic sense of view as this is positive, I'm going to get better. This is negative, and analyzing it a little bit more as you would do with criticism as well. Is there anything good I can take out of this negative comment? If the answer is obviously no, you need to kind of go disregard it. It's like, that's your opinion. I don't agree with it, and we move on.
Okay. That's great. Thank you, James. Really, really good. Okay, we've got a few more from the floor. So over to you, Chris.
Yeah, so the first one comes from Fish, and he's asked, do you have any advice for our members on how to prepare to re-enter the sporting environment after such a long period of absence?
I would say, obviously, visualization is key. It's not an easy thing to do, but it's visualizing. If you've got a very good imagination, it helps, because if you can vividly remember what it was like for we'll focus on the positive, like a very good performance, you can visualize that as well. What did the aromas feel like? What did the grass smell like? What did I see? What was the weather like? And you can put yourself in a good position to kind of say, well, this is my base point. I don't want anything, my standard of refereeing to drop below that.
Oh, that's fantastic. The next one comes from Sam Yates, and he's asked, did you find it easy to adapt between sports? And if so, was there anything you could transfer between them?
Yes and no. I say that, yeah, that answer because it was an unknown. I'd never come across volleyball in my life before that. Rowing's the same. The only time I've probably seen a rowing boat was probably the Oxford and Cambridge boat race on the television. So for me, it was the willingness to embrace the uncertainty. It's like, well, I've never been in this environment. I've got people I can ask and I can depend on to kind of steer me in the right direction. It was more like a learning curve. It was like, well, I've been in developmental sport. I haven't got time now to develop. I have to perform, and I embraced it. I took it with both arms and kind of said, well, it could be gone tomorrow. I was very fortunate to obviously do it in free sports. Not a lot of people would be able to do it in one, and I probably looked at it as every time I donned the Union Jack, it could have been the last one. So I braced it like it was the first time every single time until I retired.
James, we've come to the end of our questions and everything else for it. I'd just like to take this opportunity on behalf of the society, just for giving up your time this evening and sharing your personal journey with us. I mean, a truly incredible story. And absolutely fantastic. So as I say, on behalf of everybody, thank you very much indeed, James, for everything. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.